You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Many supporters how they think about the 2020 elections. And so that was also something that might be interesting for you to look at who the pro Lenny supporters are now supporting for 2020. It's not Lenny,
Oh,
right? So that's yeah,
who is it?
Tulfo.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Really?
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka. I've been covering public opinion surveys ever since I started in journalism, but I've never had the chance to sit down with a pollster and ask them about their work. Something I've wanted to do from pretty much the first time I ever saw a set of survey findings. If you've ever been frustrated by poll results, the kinds of questions they asked, the way they're asked, or maybe even the way they're covered by the media, you probably feel the same way. In this episode, I talked to Robin Michael Garcia. He's the Chief Executive Officer of WR Numero Research, a nonpartisan firm looking to innovate the way public opinion surveys are conducted in the Philippines, drawing from the best practices of polling firms in more mature democracies and seeing what works here and what doesn't. He walks me through their latest findings and what they mean.
Keeping in mind that this is, I think, the second publicly released edition of this survey, is there anything that you did differently this second time around that maybe you didn't do the first time around?
Yeah, so several things. So volume one and volume two are different in several ways. We asked different questions. We delved into several national issues, for example, charter change. We also talked about several foreign policy issues, position of the Filipinos regarding Taiwan.
Again, that's Robin Michael Garcia. He's a political scientist and public affairs advisor, expertise you'll hear him draw from throughout this episode.
And then there was several continuities as well. For example, one of the features of volume one and two is the probe into the 2025 elections and 2028 elections. We feel that that's an important question, or even if 2028 is still very far, it's an important question because obviously the political sort of rifts that we've been seeing the past few months. So yeah, we did delve into charter change more. We delved into the West Philippine Sea, Philippine foreign policy of the Marcos administration. So I guess the answer is it's really about the themes that we asked. The second difference is the increase in sample size.
WR Numero Research interviewed 1,800 people face to face last March 2024. That's a relatively large number of people for a publicly available poll, allowing them to bring their margin of error down to 2%. Here's another thing that sets this poll in particular apart.
So at WR Numero, we are political and social scientists. We did enter into this game or this industry just so there's another player. Like there's really a mission, and the mission is to provide political and scientific thought into polling, something that you do not find actually in the Philippines. What do I mean? What I mean is that a lot of the other firms focus on economic variables, hunger, inflation, things like that. But what we're really explicitly concerned about are social realities and political realities. So that's what we're exclusively building towards. And we did do that, especially when we introduced novel demographic variables that you can't find in other survey firms, actually. So, for example, we expanded the list of gender options, we expanded the list of voter type. So, OFWs are now part of it. So, there's a sort of very strong sociological lens that we're using as we design the research and investigate the real cognitive scripts that people have. So we're really interested in that, and so that's how we got into this whole decision or enterprise into investigating public opinion more.
Essentially, what WR Numero Research is trying to investigate each time they conduct a poll is how our social and political context is shaping public opinion. They're aiming for a deeper level of understanding, more than just a brief snapshot of how Filipinos feel about certain issues or politicians on any given month. They're trying to chart how different groups of Filipinos are processing these issues and how that affects their decision making. So, what did they find? First things first, approval of President Marcos Jr.'s performance dropped 21 percentage points over the last few months. Last December 2023, 66% of Filipinos thought he was doing either a good or very good job. That number has since whittled down to 45%.
If you look at our results, actually, the approval and support rating of President Marcos is now below 50%, which could, if they don't do well communicating and, fixing this whole issue of charter change, including inflation. Because in our survey, inflation is something that Filipinos thought the president is not doing enough about. So, that might really backfire. And the Duterte camp is using it, actually, inflation, to fan the flames, right? To increase the dissatisfaction towards the Bongbong Marcos presidency. And that's something that we see that they're actively doing.
Members of the Duterte family have also accused Marcos of illegal drug use, called for his resignation, and continued to oppose his administration's push for charter change.
But you also don't have a presidential spokesperson, right? And then there were several changes in the communications department, which is ironic because they haven't really done a very good job in communicating. There were several PR disasters. Charter change was a PR disaster, if you ask me. The Maharlika bill was a PR disaster, if you ask me. The point is, they haven't really communicated well. And that's why we're seeing a decline in legitimacy and the approval rating of the president.
How much do you think the decrease in approval is down to communication? And how much of it is actually disapproval in his performance?
So it's both the actual material depravity that people feel, but also that the Marcos administration is not doing a good job defending themselves, is my point. So it's all of these factors, right? So you have a real on the ground material depravity. People are worse off economically. And people actually feel the rising prices and they're affected. And then you have the lack of communications.
More on the Marcos administration's communication problem and its far reaching consequences after a quick break. Again, here's Robin, WR Numero Research CEO, talking us through why the president's team may be struggling with their messaging.
Election campaigns and governing are two different things, right? So if you did well during the campaign, it's not a guarantee that you'll do well communicating, at least and campaigning for yourself while you're in power. Probably they understand that, but it's something that they have to act upon. But it's not only the attacks of the Duterte group, actually, it's the attacks of the opposition group and the more neutral groups in the Senate. Because of this charter change issue, there's actually three groups now attacking Marcos. So it's the Senate. And these people have national mandates, so that Respo, Joel Villanueva. These are senators, right? So they have obviously some following. So if they speak against you, you have a problem. And then you have opposition, even if it's just Risa. There are members of civil society that have espoused against the charter change issue. And then you have stronger calls for resignation of the Duterte camp. So there's really just a lot of attacks, and they open themselves up to those attacks because of this charter change issue. I don't know why they continue to insist on this policy reform. It's not necessarily bad. In fact, I think several. If you look at the results, a lot of Filipinos actually support charter change, but most of them do not support the charter change reform proposal.
Vice President Duterte saw a 13% drop too, but is still faring better than the president, with 60% of Filipinos still approving of her performance.
And we've talked a lot about support for President Marcos dropping, a little less so for Vice President Sara Duterte. How well positioned do you think she is for 2028 after a couple of years of being Vice President?
So surveys are supposed to capture snapshots of specific time period. So the question is always that if the elections were held today, if the 2028 elections were held today, so it's not about who will you vote for in 2028, right? So it's two different frames now. If you ask people, so it's a question of how much will change, and we're seeing a lot of change actually.
Both the first and second edition of WR Numero's public opinion survey saw Senator Tulfo rank as second pick for the presidency behind Sara Duterte. The second edition saw him trail the vice president by 6 points. 23% of respondents said they would vote for him if elections were today.
I mean, in other survey firms, and in fact, he's already leading. But for us, there's still a huge gap, but the gap is now single digits, and so that's actually worrying for Sara Duterte if she has ambitions. Both of them have said that they don't have ambitions, but that's just their announcement, right? But we know that they are the front runners in 2028. There's several variables we have to think about, social changes, what the opposition will do, changes in general public opinion about issues, and things like that. But the more that Sara Duterte, and Bongbong Marcos are fighting, the more that Senator Tulfo can actually capitalize on that disagreement between the two parties and provide a third way or an alternative.
That's very interesting because what I'm hearing there also is that, even though a brunt of the attacks being fielded by the Marcos administration is coming from the Duterte camp or at least their supporters, that doesn't necessarily mean that Sara is now in a better position as a result of those attacks. In fact, what you're saying seems to be that that might actually be creating a path for a third candidate.
Yeah, so I mean, the more that they fight each other, the assumption is that it's a black and white for the voters that if you effectively launch an attack against Sara Duterte, that the voters will transfer to you. That's a mistake because they might actually transfer to someone else and they might not like both of you, and therefore both of you will lose. It's mutually assured destruction. And so the direction of vote dispersion is something that we're seeing towards Tulfo. That's a trend that might continue, against Sara Duterte.
As you heard mentioned at the top of this episode, Senator Tulfo is pulling support from unexpected groups, including Vice President Robredo's supporters.
I mean, Lenny is still, of course, one of the top candidates that they're supporting. But again, the vote dispersal is going towards another direction. It's also because the vice president has not indicated that she's going to run, and some people also, pro Lenny supporters might already think that Lenny has done her job and maybe she should move on and do other things, right? Not out of spite for Lenny, but out of actually support and care for the vice president.
Any idea why that support from Lenny went to Tulfo? I mean, at least some of it.
Tulfo has been quite vocal in issues that he doesn't disagree with, and some of those issues are issues that the administration is supporting. So right now, there's a fight for who is the opposition, and I would say, as an observer, the strongest voice is actually Duterte. Duterte is now the new opposition. The opposition, Lenny Robredo and the rest, they haven't really been vocal. And it's only Senator Risa Ontiveros who's been vocal against Bongbong Marcos and the rest. And even in those issues, like for example, Senator Ontiveros and Bongbong Marcos agree on this anti-China narrative. So they converge in some areas. So it's not really purely opposition. And Lenny Robredo has not, and anyone in the opposition has not actually said anything about charter change, right? So there's not opposing, is the point. So there's really not a lot of activity coming from them, and that's dangerous for 2025 because if they lose in 2025, that's the fourth election that they will lose already.
You can sign up for WR Numero Research's mailing list to access their latest surveys for free. We'll leave a link in this episode's show notes. Other highlights from their newest poll include continued support for the International Criminal Court's probe of former President Duterte's drug war, approval of the Senate's inquiry into Apollo Quiboloy, and concern over both the increased tension in the West Philippine Sea and between the Marcos and Duterte camps. That was today's episode of Teka Teka. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Keep an eye out for part 2 of this conversation next week, where I asked WR Numero Research CEO and political scientist Robin Garcia, why do polls even matter? Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our editor-in-chief is Carl Javier. And if you have a friend who might be interested in this poll and its findings, it would be so helpful if you sent them this episode. Thanks for listening.